The morning Curtis Halliday decided to bring the watch to the auction, he almost didn't. It sat on the kitchen counter the way it always did, face up, crystal scratched, the leather strap cracked along the fold where his father used to bend his wrist to check the time. Curtis had looked at it while the coffee brewed, and the toast went cold, and for a moment he thought about leaving it there, the way he'd left it there every morning for 11 years, without once considering what it might be worth to anyone other than him. His daughter Paige wandered in at 7:15, still in her school socks, dragging her backpack by one strap. "Are you actually wearing that jacket?" she said. "What's wrong with my jacket?" "Nothing." She opened the fridge and stared into it. "It's just a lot of corduroy." Curtis looked down at himself. The jacket was old, everything he owned was old. That was not something he spent much time thinking about. He poured Paige a glass of orange juice and set it on the counter beside the watch, and Paige picked up the watch and turned it over in her hands the way she'd done since she was small, examining the case back, the tiny inscription her grandfather had never explained to either of them. "You're bringing it today?" "Thinking about it. You should." She set it down carefully. Grandpa would have thought the whole thing was funny. Curtis thought his father would have thought a great many things about the Whitmore Estates charitable auction, none of them particularly printable. Robert Halliday had been a machinist from Sudbury who wore his good watch to church and his work clothes everywhere else and had never once in his life attended anything described as a gala. But he'd left Curtis the watch and a cedar chest full of tools and not much else, and Curtis had been a single father for 9 years by then, and the bills that came in January had a particular quality to them that made a man reconsider what he'd been keeping in a drawer. He slipped the watch into his jacket pocket and drove Paige to school. The Whitmore Estates charitable auction took place every October in the atrium of the Beaumont Financial Building in downtown Hamilton, Ontario. It was one of those events that existed in 2 registers simultaneously, a genuine fundraiser for the Hamilton Children's Hospital Foundation, and also an occasion for the kind of people who attended genuine fundraisers to be seen attending one. The atrium had been done up with white tablecloths and small arrangements of late-season flowers, and a string trio played near the entrance, and the lighting had been adjusted to make everyone look slightly more expensive than they actually were. Curtis arrived at 9 in the morning for the consignor intake, which was the unglamorous counterpart to the afternoon's main event. He'd signed up to consign 3 items, a set of his father's woodworking planes that a dealer in Brantford had told him were worth appraising, a small oil painting that had hung in his parents' hallway for 40 years, and the watch. The intake table was staffed by 2 young women with lanyards and clipboards who processed his woodworking planes and the painting with brisk efficiency, tagging them and filling out the lot numbers, while Curtis answered questions about provenance that he could only partially answer. Then he set the watch on the table. The woman with the clipboard, her lanyard said Brittany, picked it up and looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they've already decided isn't interesting. "Make and model," she said. "I was hoping you could tell me," Curtis said. "It was my father's. He never said where he got it. There's an inscription on the case back." Brittany turned it over. "Read the inscription." Turned it back over, set it on the table. "We'd need to have one of our specialists take a look," she said. "But I have to be honest with you. We get a lot of estate watches, and unless there's documentation, it's hard to assign meaningful value. Do you have any paperwork? Box, warranty card?" Curtis did not have any paperwork. "The inscription might indicate something," he said. "My father wasn't the kind of man who bought cheap things, but he also wasn't the kind of man who talked about what things cost." Brittany made a note. "We can have Marcus take a look during setup. He handles the timepiece lots." She tagged the watch with a provisional lot number and set it in a plastic tray with 2 other watches, both of which Curtis noticed came in velvet pouches with presentation boxes. He went and got a coffee from the side table and sat in a chair near the window and watched Hamilton's skyline in the gray October light and tried not to think about the January bills. He was still sitting there at 10:30 when the morning's dynamic shifted. He heard her before he saw her. The voice carried a specific quality, not loud exactly, but pitched with the unconscious certainty of someone who had spent years being listened to. Curtis looked up and saw a woman in a charcoal wool blazer moving through the atrium with the assistance of 2 staff members who were holding tablets and trying to keep pace. Her name, he would later learn, was Vivian Thorne. She was the chief executive of Thorne Capital Management, a firm that Curtis had never heard of but which, he gathered from the conversations happening around him, managed something in the neighborhood of $2 billion in assets and was headquartered on King Street West in Toronto. She was perhaps 50, trim and precise, with the kind of face that suggested she found most situations mildly insufficient. She was also, it turned out, the presenting sponsor of the auction, which meant the event was, in some meaningful sense, hers. Vivian Thorne moved through the intake area the way a current moves through water, without appearing to try. She paused at the display of consigned items being arranged along the east wall, exchanged a few words with the auction director, approved something on a tablet, and then drifted toward the timepiece table where Marcus, the specialist, had begun examining the watch lots. Curtis watched this from his chair by the window and did not think much of it until Vivian Thorne picked up his father's watch. She held it at arm's length, turned it once. Her expression didn't change, but something around the eyes did. A faint contraction, the look of someone deciding something. "Where did this come from?" she said to Brittany. "Consignment. Walk in this morning. Who walked it in?" Brittany's eyes moved briefly in Curtis's direction and Vivian Thorne's followed. Curtis stood up. "That's mine," he said. "My father's, technically." Vivian Thorne looked at him. She took in the corduroy jacket and the coffee cup and the chair by the window, and whatever she concluded from those things shaped the tone of what she said next. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said. "We have a responsibility to our donors and to the hospital to curate this event carefully. Not everything that comes through consignment is appropriate for the room." Curtis felt something tighten in his chest, but he kept his face even. "Meaning what?" "Meaning this is a high-end event. Our bidders have expectations." She set the watch back in the tray, not gently. "An unpapered estate watch in this condition isn't going to generate meaningful interest. It may actually work against the room's energy." She said this the way someone says something they've decided to say as a favor. "You'd be better served by a general auction house, Ritchie's perhaps, or one of the estate sales on James Street." The two staff members with tablets had stopped typing. Curtis looked at the watch in the tray, looked at Vivian Thorne. "My father wore that watch for 40 years, he said. "He was a machinist. He bought it himself. He never told me what it was, but he treated it like it mattered." "I'm sure it did," Vivian Thorne said, in the tone of someone for whom the conversation was already finished to him. She moved on to the next table. Curtis sat back down in his chair by the window and held his coffee cup with both hands and looked at the floor for a while. Paige had a hockey tournament in Ancaster on Saturday, and he needed to get her skates sharpened, and the timing belt on the Civic was making a sound he didn't like, and January was 3 months away. He thought about getting up and taking the watch home. He thought about his father's hands, which had been wide and rough and had smelled of machine oil and sawdust, and how those hands had buckled that strap every Sunday morning without ceremony, without explanation, as if wearing the watch were simply part of what a man did. He left the watch in the tray. Marcus arrived at the timepiece table at 11:15. He was a compact man in his 60s with a jeweler's loop clipped to his breast pocket, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who spend their working lives examining small things very carefully. He picked up each watch in sequence. The two in velvet pouches he set aside quickly, making notes. Then he picked up Curtis's watch. He didn't set it aside, he turned it over. He uncapped his loop and fitted it to his eye. He examined the case back for a long time. The inscription, the hallmarks, the seam where the case met the back. And then he turned it over again and looked at the dial with the same unhurried attention. Then he did something Curtis hadn't expected. He set the watch down carefully, took out his phone and made a call. Curtis watched this from across the room and told himself it meant nothing. Marcus spoke quietly for several minutes, listened, spoke again. Then he ended the call and crossed the atrium to where Curtis was sitting. "Mr. Halliday, yes." Marcus sat down in the adjacent chair, which was something Curtis had not expected a specialist to do. He held the watch in both hands, face up. "Can I ask where your father acquired this?" "I don't know," Curtis said. "He never said. He had it as long as I can remember." "And the inscription on the case back, do you know what it refers to?" Curtis had memorized the inscription years ago. "For R.H. Falconbridge, 1971. With thanks." His initials were R.H., Curtis said. "Robert Halliday. He worked at Falconbridge Nickel in Sudbury. Started there in 1968. Marcus nodded slowly. He turned the watch over again and looked at the case back. "Mr. Halliday," he said, "I want to be careful about what I tell you right now because a proper assessment would require documentation I don't currently have access to. But I'm going to tell you what I believe I'm looking at." He paused. "This appears to be a reference 2499 by Patek Philippe. First series based on the dial configuration and the case proportions. If that's accurate, and I believe it is, this watch was made in Switzerland in the early 1950s. The reference 2499 is one of the most significant perpetual calendar chronographs Patek Philippe ever produced. In auction in recent years, examples in lesser condition than this one have sold for between $1 and $2 million. Examples in better condition have sold for considerably more." Curtis heard the words. He processed them in the way the brain processes information that doesn't yet have a category. Slowly, with a quality of unreality, like hearing a weather report for a country you've never visited. "I'm sorry," he said. How much? Marcus repeated it. He said the number calmly and without embellishment, the way someone states a fact. Curtis looked at the watch. My father was a machinist, he said. Yes, Marcus said, and someone at Falconbridge, someone who understood what this watch was, gave it to him in 1971. That's what the inscription tells us, and your father apparently wore it to church. Curtis laughed. He didn't mean to. It came out of him suddenly, the kind of laugh that is very close to something else, and he covered his mouth with his hand and looked out the window at the gray Hamilton sky and thought about his father buckling that strap on Sunday mornings without ever once explaining why. Vivian Thorne was in a meeting with the auction director when Marcus found her. Curtis didn't witness the conversation directly. He was standing near the timepiece table, holding a fresh coffee he didn't remember getting, when he saw Marcus approach the group near the east wall and say something quietly to the auction director. He saw the auction director's expression change. He saw her say something to Vivian Thorne. He saw Vivian Thorne look across the room at him. She came over herself, no staff, no tablets. She walked across the atrium at a pace that was not quite the pace she'd used before, and she stopped in front of Curtis, and there was a pause, the kind of pause that has something working in it, some adjustment happening behind the face. Mr. Halliday, she said, I understand I may have been premature in my assessment this morning. Curtis looked at her. You told me to take it to a general auction house. I did. You said it would work against the room's energy. Vivian Thorne held his gaze. She was not, he realized, a person who was accustomed to this position, and she was not performing discomfort, she was actually feeling it, which was something. I made an assumption based on appearance, she said. That was a mistake. You made an assumption based on the jacket, Curtis said. She didn't deny it. There was another pause. Around them the atrium continued its preparations, tablecloths being smoothed, flowers being adjusted, the string trio working through something slow and minor in the corner. We would be very pleased to feature the watch as a headline lot, Vivian Thorne said. If you're willing. I can have Marcus prepare a full written assessment by the afternoon, and we'll update the catalog. It would be the centerpiece of the timepiece section. Curtis looked at the watch, which Marcus had returned to the tray. He thought about Paige in her school socks, turning it over in her hands. Grandpa would have thought the whole thing was funny. What's the commission structure, he said. 15% on hammer price. I'll want that in writing. Of course, and I want a copy of Marcus's full assessment. For my records, that's standard, Vivian Thorne said. Curtis nodded. He picked up the watch and looked at it one more time. The scratched crystal, the cracked strap, the dial that had been keeping time in his father's kitchen and his father's truck and his father's front pew at St. Andrew's for longer than Curtis had been alive, and then he set it back in the tray. You should know, he said, that my father would have found this whole morning very funny, including the part where you told me to leave. Vivian Thorne looked at him for a moment. And then, for the first time since he'd seen her, something in her face moved that wasn't business. A brief, genuine thing, reluctant but real. I imagine he would have, she said. She walked back across the atrium. No staff materialized around her this time. She moved through the room without the current, just a woman in a wool blazer who had learned something about watches and perhaps also something else, walking back toward whatever came next. The auction ran that afternoon from 2 until 6. Curtis sat in the back row and watched the room fill with people who owned things he had never owned and wore things he had never considered wearing, and he thought about the January bills and Paige's hockey tournament and the timing belt and his father's hands, and he waited. The watch was lot 47. The auctioneer introduced it with a composure that was itself a kind of theater, measured, precise, the language of enormous numbers spoken as if they were ordinary. He referenced the reference number, the period, the provenance note about Falconbridge 1971, which he delivered in a way that made the room very quiet. The bidding opened at $350,000. Curtis sat in the back row and did not move. He watched paddles go up and come down. He watched the number climb, 500, 600, 750, with the patient incrementalism of things whose value has already been decided by history and is only now being confirmed by the present. He watched the room thin as the number passed 1 million, the bidders down to 3, then 2, then the kind of silence that precedes something being finished. The hammer came down at $1,460,000. Curtis sat very still for a moment. The man beside him, a silver-haired gentleman in a blue blazer who'd been consulting a catalog all afternoon, glanced over and said quietly, "Yours, my father's," Curtis said. The man nodded, said nothing else, went back to his catalog. Curtis looked at his hands for a while. They were not his father's hands, not wide enough, not rough enough, not marked by the same 40 years of the same work. But they were what he had, and they were, he realized, not shaking. He got up and made his way toward the consignor desk to begin the paperwork, and outside the tall windows of the Beaumont Financial Atrium, Hamilton was doing what it always did in October, going about its business in the gray and particular light of a city that has never needed to be glamorous to be worth something. He picked up Paige from her friend's place at 6:30. She got in the car and looked at his face and said, "What happened? We need to get your skates sharpened," Curtis said. "Dad." He pulled out of the driveway and onto the street. The Civic made its sound from somewhere under the hood, and the streetlights were coming on along the way home, and Curtis thought about what it meant to carry something valuable for a long time without knowing what it was, to wear it on your wrist every Sunday, to pass it down without ceremony or explanation, to trust that the person who received it would know what to do. "Grandpa left us something," he said. Paige was quiet for a moment. "The watch? The watch." She looked out the passenger window. The houses went by, ordinary and lit from inside, the kind of neighborhood where people sharpened their skates and worried about timing belts and made coffee while their toast went cold. "Is it enough?" she said. Curtis thought about the number the hammer had confirmed, and the 15% that would go to the atrium and the hospital foundation and the lights and the flowers and the string trio, and the amount that remained, which was more than enough by any measure he'd ever used to define that word. "Yeah," he said. "It's enough." Paige nodded once and settled into her seat. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't ask what they'd do with it. She was 13 and she knew somehow that some things answer themselves in the doing of them and that the rest would keep until morning. Curtis drove them home through the October dark, and the city held them the way cities do, imperfectly, without ceremony, with the steady indifference that is its own kind of grace.